next up, everybody, we've got Nate Kleinman from the Experimental Seed Network. He's gonna bring us some amazing topics on preserving and expanding crop diversity. He's going to give us some input on the Cooperative Gardens Commission that they've been gearing up for another big seed distribution and recruiting seed hubs to help with that distribution. So Nate, if you're ready, let's send it on over to you.
All right, thanks Scott, Tony. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Nate Kleinman. As Scott said, I am the co-founder of the Experimental Farm Network, which is a nonprofit technically based in Philadelphia. I live in South Jersey in Salem County and farm down here. I'm a seed farmer. I'm going to share my screen to go through this talk. Yeah, as Scott mentioned, the Cooperative Gardens Commission is a project that we started in the spring. It's not in my talk, but I did just want to make a pitch for it. If you check out coopgardens.com, you'll be able to see information recruiting new seed hubs to help us with our free seed distribution. And if you are with a seed company or you have lots of seeds, we are actively recruiting donations of seed to be able to have another big seed distribution. Last year, we distributed through 257 local seed hubs in 41 states. We started in March toward like March 20th or so. And we think that we got seeds into about 12,000 gardens. Once again, this year, there's seed companies are running out of seed and shutting down their websites because the demand is so great. So we're hoping that everybody who needs seed can access it. All right, let me figure out this screen share. All right. Could somebody confirm for me that you're seeing that and not my face?
It looks great.
Okay, thank you. All right, so my topic today is preserving and expanding crop biodiversity. This is an issue that's really important to me, and I think I hope by the end of this talk it will be important to you as well, if it's not already. It's going to be a mix of pretty pictures and some charts and some practical knowledge on what you can do as a farmer or a gardener to get involved in the movement to help us expand crop biodiversity. So it's in the beginning, I just put some pretty pictures of some seeds that I like to grow, some crops that I like to grow. And these are the first few are things that we have sold through Experimental Farm Network, which we're a nonprofit, but we fund our work through seed sales. This is a melon from the Maldives. It seems that it was bred for the gel around the seeds and not for the flesh, like a standard melon, or a familiar cantaloupe or honeydew. It's got a sour flavor. It looks like it should be sweet, but it's pretty sour. When these fruit are small, they can be used just like a cucumber, and they come in sort of different colors. This is a diverse variety. We call it Hitadu Maldives melon because that's the atoll where it comes from, Hitadu Maldives in the Indian Ocean. This is a pepper. It's called the Zipser Turkenspitz. It's from a people called the Zips, who were a German minority group in Slovakia. And the Zips were mostly expelled at the end of World War II. And so they're sort of a Zipser diaspora now. And William Moyes Weaver met a Zipser person in a cafe in Vienna, and they gave him these seeds. Beautiful pepper. It ripens to sort of an orange red. It's a sweet pepper. This is a cucumber from Bhutan. It's called gagon or gagon. We don't really know how it's pronounced. When it's small, it looks like a normal cucumber. As it gets bigger, it gets this sort of red lizard skin, and it can be treated like a vegetable. or like you can cook it like squash or something, and it almost is sweet. Really good for juicing, and it's also pretty downy mildew resistant. These are just some beautiful white currants, one of my favorite fruits. This is imperial white, one of the more common varieties. And these are Coronis purple beans. That's a bush bean bred in Minnesota by a guy named Robert Lobitz. Really tasty bean. And this is a squash. It is supposed to look like that. That's a green-fleshed Guatemalan squash. They call all squash like this, they call ayote in that part of Guatemala. But this has got a really great flavor. Probably has a slightly different nutritional profile, but we're not exactly sure. And the last picture in this chunk is just to give you a little bit more taste of crop diversity. I spent one morning at the Santa Monica Farmers Market a couple of winters ago and came back with this box. And I enjoyed it for the rest of my week, 2 weeks in LA. You can see those purple avocados have such thin skin that you're actually supposed to eat the skin. Those little orange ones at the top are mandarin quats, a cross between a kumquat and a mandarin. It's a Buddha's hand citron on the right, some white raspberries on top. Those little raisin-looking things are called date persimmons. Somebody else's mic is on here. Maybe keep an eye on that. Anyway, there's my little taste of crop diversity for you. We'll go into some numbers in a second. So, if you know anything about agriculture in the United States and around the world, you know that monoculture is pretty much the standard way that we grow food. That means growing a single crop over a large area. It looks a lot like this. It's a cornfield, or a field of soybeans, a field of wheat, big old field of sugar beets harvested into a big pile, or this is canola, also called rapeseed. This chart shows a list of 28 crop species compiled from the 10 most important on each continent in terms of acres harvested in 2007. You can see maize is the #1 crop in both Africa and North America, #2 in South America, #3 in Asia, 3 in Europe, 19th in Oceania.
Yes, I do. I have one.
Mostly Australia. Watch if your mic is on there. Somebody's got their mic on. Sorghum, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, is the #2 crop in Africa, #7 in North America. But as you can see, these are sort of the main crops that are grown around the world. Most of them are annual crops, things like millet, cowpeas, wheat, rice, ground nuts or peanuts, cotton, barley, dry beans. Fresh vegetables is its own category, which includes a whole range of vegetables. I just think it's important to sort of get a grounding in what people are growing around the world. This slide is really important. It shows the agricultural biodiversity per acre. So this is it says global crop richness map, number of harvested crops per hectare, combining 175 different crops. So you can see the blue areas are where there's the most diversity grown, and the yellow areas are where there is the least. And unfortunately, the majority of places around the world are getting less and less diverse. And even in those places where there's still a lot of blue, the Mediterranean, the Bay of Bengal, northeastern China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, these places are also becoming less and less biodiverse. In places like Indonesia, palm oil is taking over. In places like China, they're starting to grow a lot more like we do with corn and soy monocropping. And in places like the Mediterranean, a lot of the people who are still growing these crops are getting older, and younger people are not taking over and not growing in the same kind of diversity that people were growing. And of course, North America is the most yellow place on this map, the United States in particular. And you can see California is one of the only sort of green parts, and maybe a little bit in the Pacific Northwest, but we have there's a huge lack of biodiversity on the average farm. And yet when you go to the supermarket, there's all these different colors, all these different brands. There's this myth of abundance propagated by modern neoliberal capitalism, and yet the more you dig in, the more you look into it, you realize that so many of these foods are being produced with the same base ingredients, and with all the different names on the shelves. The reality is it's all controlled by a handful of extremely large companies that are just trying to make a profit off you. Obviously, you can take a quick look at this and see if there's any companies that you buy from and you didn't realize that they're really owned by somebody bigger, like Ocean Spray. That line goes all the way down to Pepsi. So does Fritos and Tostitos and Rolled Gold and Cheetos. So many different brands, and yet it's all these few big companies. And that same problem exists in the seed industry, which I'm going to talk more about. And this chart is actually out of date. This was made in 2013, and since then, DuPont and Dow have merged, and Monsanto and Bayer have merged. The two in the bottom right and the two at the top. So there's even fewer companies controlling the global seed supply, and that has huge ramifications for crop biodiversity. All of that biodiversity is really at the root of our resilience as a species to climate change, to other kinds of shocks based on war and famine and poverty. But climate changes and environmental collapse are by far the biggest problems that we face as a species. Another slide to illustrate this. This image shows on the top a survey of different vegetables in 1903, looking at different seed catalogs. The Rural Advancement Foundation International, RAFI, made this some years ago. And so, yeah, this actually shows the decline in these varieties from 1903 to 1983. So that's even a while ago. There were 497 varieties of lettuce available in the seed catalogs that they surveyed. When they looked to see if those same seeds were available in the National Seed Storage Laboratory, they found only 36 of them. Radishes, 463 down to 27. Squash, 341 down to 40. And that loss of biodiversity has been mirrored in pretty much every crop you can imagine. And it's a huge problem because as the weather changes, as the climate changes, we need diversity to be able to survive. We need plant breeders who have access to genetic materials to be crossing things together and creating new varieties that can withstand the extremes of our changing planet. This is a pretty simple slide. Came from the numbers come from the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. The BBC made this image. Overall, there are about 6,000 crop species that have been cultivated for food, and but the vast majority of food that we consume is just 200 species, and of those, 9 account for a full 2/3 of current crop production around the world. Those 9 are listed on this next slide here: sugarcane, corn, rice, wheat, potatoes, soybeans, oil palm, sugar beet, and cassava, which is also called yucca in Latin America. So you can see some of the threats to wild food species. I'm going to talk a little bit later about wild foods and crop wild relatives, and that's in this section coming up. So when we talk about conserving crop biodiversity, there's really 2 main sets: what's called in situ conservation and then ex situ conservation. I'll talk about in situ first. That's Latin, basically means in place, conserving biodiversity in place. So in traditional farming cultures, there exists a wide range of diversity because people don't have access to, historically anyway, they didn't have access to seeds that were bred in university programs or by corporations. They have what's available in their local farm store or from their neighbors or from their own seed stocks. So this is just a little image of some Turkish landrace wheats collected in 2012. I'll talk a little bit about what that term landrace means in a second. And here are some corn varieties from Mexico. Really, this is just a snippet of the amazing diversity that exists in corn in Mexico alone. And actually, some of these, some of these are not Mexican. This is some of these are Peruvian. But there's thousands and thousands of varieties of corn. So a landrace is a term that's used to talk about a dynamic population of a cultivated plant that has a historical origin, distinct identity, and lacks formal crop improvement. It's also genetically diverse, locally adapted, and associated with traditional farming systems. I have a slightly more expansive definition here. A variable population, it's identifiable, usually has a local name, lacks formal crop improvement, characterized by specific adaptation to the local environmental conditions, and closely associated with the traditional uses, knowledge, habits, dialects, and celebrations of the people who developed and continue to grow it. So land races are really at the base of all of the modern crops that people grow today. All of the modern crop breeding programs over the last 120 years have been based in land races that they have, for the most part, gone around the world. Scientists have gone around the world and taken these from other places without compensating the original growers, and in many ways without respecting the traditions from which these seeds came. That's something that, as somebody who has done some plant breeding and aspires to do more, it's something that I grapple with as an ethical consideration. Here's another image of a landrace. This is one that we got the seeds from the USDA collection. This is from Kandahar, Afghanistan. It's okra. You can see there's lots of diversity in this population. There's short pods, fat pods, long pods, pale ones, dark ones, reddish ones. This is one of my favorite landrace crops, the Nanticoke squash. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape people live in the southern part of New Jersey, near where I live, and this is a squash that is believed to be historically connected to that people. And it's I'm pretty certain that this squash, because of the location, the Nanticoke people historically lived on both sides of the Delaware Bay and on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake. In the 1600s, 1700s, that was a center for global trade, both of those areas. Ships would go around the world, and many of these squash can keep for, I've had one keep on my kitchen counter for 18 months. So they are, they could keep on a ship and travel around the world. And so much of the diversity that exists in varieties of squash that we consider heirlooms from other countries like Italy or France or Australia have a lot of similarities to this population. You can see ones that are sort of like a red curry squash from Japan, or like a kabocha, or a Turk's turban squash, which is actually a French variety. It's a beautiful landrace. This is one of my favorite individual squash that came up out of that population once. So in situ conservation means preserving crop biodiversity in the places where those crops are traditional, where they come from. That means, most importantly, preserving them with the people from whom they came. And so in situ conservation can involve things like localized seed banks. This is a small seed bank in India, and this is a seed bank where the seeds are used every year. Traditional seed storage, like this bamboo bin with a coconut shell opening. This is a seed storage house in a village in Ethiopia, and this is they call this a rhombus. This is a traditional seed storage building, a mud rhombus made in Nigeria, and people are still using things like this to store seeds, and this is how this is really where the roots of agriculture around the world come from, in traditional farming communities like this one. But in addition to in situ conservation of traditional crops that are used as crops, in situ conservation also covers conservation of crop wild relatives, which are plants that exist in the wild and are related to crops that we eat. This slide just has some examples of a few of the wild crops that are closely related to crops that we regularly eat. On the top left, you can see a wild sunflower and the cultivated sunflower. There's a wild bean, and then our cultivated beans, a wild grass that's related to wheat, and another wild grass related to corn. And then in the slide on the right, you can see some of the important traits that these crops have that help the modern plant breeder with certain problems, like Eastern filbert blight resistance can be conferred from the American filbert to the European hazelnut that is very susceptible to that Eastern filbert blight. Or on the bottom left, Western corn rootworm resistance can come from Eastern gamagrass and be bred into corn. So this slide has some sad trends in the status of some wild food species. And these are not just crop wild relatives, but these are plants that are eaten as food, just harvested right out of the wild. You can see in Africa, the vast majority are decreasing. In fact, in Asia, the vast majority are increasing. In Latin America, also the majority are decreasing. Europe is one of the only places where the populations of wild food crops are stable or increasing. In the Pacific, it's close, and in North America, they have not adequately surveyed this. But if you ask anybody who's out there harvesting ginseng or harvesting ramps, there's a lot of decreases as well in important wild food species on this continent. So crop wild relatives are really vital. These are the plants that our modern crops have all been bred from over the last 10,000 years of agriculture. And this map shows where there are hotspots of biodiversity in the wild, but there are of crop wild relatives, but they've been assessed as being in urgent need of collection to improve their representation in gene banks. We're going to talk about gene banks in the next section, but you can see the areas in yellow and red and green are the areas where there's many more species in need of further collecting. The Mediterranean region being one of the most urgent, southeastern China, western Indonesia, also the Amazon basin and the savannas south of the Amazon in Brazil, and then Eastern North America does not get off scot-free either. We have there's plenty of wild relatives of important crops that grow in Eastern North America, and they also need further representation, better representation in gene banks for future plant breeders and for conserving what biodiversity is left. Habitat destruction is the biggest problem around the world. Development and development for agriculture, for housing, for industry, for extraction of natural resources. These are the biggest threats to most of these crop wild relatives, in addition to simply over harvesting by people who are out there harvesting for food. Just put in a few images of some crop wild relatives. This is a beet relative from the Caucasus that's a perennial. This is just a little seedling. It looks like chard once it gets bigger. Tastes very similar as well. This is a bitter watermelon from Africa. This is another watermelon relative from Africa. This is an actual watermelon from the government collection. This one's from Syria, and I can never resist throwing this image in a slideshow. This is obviously a pineapple. This is as big as that pineapple's ever going to get. That's a wild relative of the domesticated pineapple. And yeah, it is the cutest pineapple you're probably going to see.
Adorable, Nate.
I know.
Where can we get seeds for that? That's so cute.
I've never seen anybody selling seeds for that, but if you can find one, all you have to do is take that little crown off and put it in some soil and it'll grow. It's largely clonally propagated. I'm sure there are seeds in there. I think that's called Ananas camosus. Yeah, I found that in Puerto Rico, and I tried to cultivate it from the crown, but I failed. Here's another crop wild relative, and then I'll launch into a brief story about it. This is a wild strawberry called Fragaria chiloensis, named after an island off the coast of Chile called Chiloe. That is a sweet little strawberry. It's also called beach strawberry. And this next one is the American strawberry, Fragaria virginiana. This one comes from Maine. It was collected by a USDA scientist at a rest stop on Route 1 in Maine. I grow this one. It's really delicious, and I got it because the description in the USDA database said that the fruit tested very highly for anti-cancer activity in vitro in a petri dish against a particular kind of lung cancer cell. So I thought that was pretty cool. But that's this species and the last one, the Fragaria kiloensis. They met each other in the 1800s in a garden in France, and they crossed inadvertently, it seems, and the result was a bigger, fleshier strawberry, and that's the strawberry that we know today. It didn't exist 150 years ago, and now it's one of the most important fruit crops around the world. And without preserving these wild species, we would lose a huge reservoir of genetic diversity that can help with us continuing to be able to have strawberries into the future. Every year, new pests and diseases emerge that threaten to wipe out all of the food that we eat. We've seen it happen with bananas. It's happening again. We've seen it with citrus happening right now. Obviously, the potato famine in Ireland is one of the most well-known stories of this kind of thing happening. So preserving as much of that diversity as we can is really critical, and conserving it in the places where it originated is absolutely key. I'm going to talk a bit more about in situ later, but I'm going to move to ex situ conservation. That's conserving out of place. This is a soybean seed bank in Russia. And there are a number of seed banks around the world. Most countries have their own. And if you're a plant breeder, you can access these seeds. This is the website for IPK Gottersleben in Germany, which is the big German seed bank. Has a really marvelous collection. ICARDA is an international consortium for, they call it crops from the dry areas. That's the DA stands for. So these are arid land crops. The Centro Internacional de Agricultura Tropical is the international collection. They maintain the world's best bean collection down in Colombia. This is a picture of a lima bean that is truly gorgeous. And these are also things that can be accessed by researchers in other countries. Other seed collections include the Seed Savers Exchange collection. They have over 20,000 seeds in their collection based in Iowa. And they also maintain this thing called the Yearbook, which is a seed exchange where there are tens of thousands of more varieties that their members maintain and make available to other people. And Seed Savers Exchange has been a really critical organization for a long time. I have some old issues of the Yearbook, and you can see sort of just an immense amount of diversity in the pages of these books. There's other countries have similar organizations like that. In Switzerland, there's one called Ark Noah, which means Noah's Ark, and it's possible, especially if you know somebody in Europe, to access some of these seeds. There are some permits required to get seeds from other countries into this country, but it's not impossible. Down in Florida, there's a group called ECHO that has a global seed bank with mostly tropical crops, and they provide free trial seeds for development workers who bring them to other countries. And in this country, we have what's called the National Plant Germplasm System, the NPGS, that's run by the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, through the Agricultural Research Service, ARS. And I'm going to dive into this a little bit because I want to give folks who are interested some practical knowledge on how to access some of these seeds. Our government has over 500,000 varieties of seeds in these gene banks. And as I mentioned, these have been collected since the late 1800s. You can actually find seeds in the database that have been there, maintained by the government since the 1890s. And these have been collected from communities around the world. In many cases, those communities are no longer farming communities anymore. They are in so many of the crops that that have been made their way into this system just no longer exist in situ. They only exist in these collections, and that's for a wide range of reasons, but largely the globalization of agriculture and the loss of traditional farming practices and cultures. But as somebody who makes regular use of this system, I believe that it's really important to think all the time about where these seeds come from, and to have a deep respect and reverence for those people and cultures from which these seeds have come. And in many cases, those cultures and peoples are still do still exist, and there are still farmers in those communities. They may not have access to these seeds anymore. So I think it's important to consider when we can returning those seeds. And I have a little section of this talk that talks about that process, which we refer to as rematriation. So the U.S. germplasm system, the website can be accessed at ars-grin.gov, and you can take a look at that website yourself if you would like. So if you're interested in getting seeds from the USDA, there's also animal germplasm and microbial germplasm available, but I've never used those. Microbial would be like things for cheese or different kinds of yeast, or really all sorts of different microbes that are used in particular for food. Animals, obviously lots of different livestock and stuff. So, sorry, I'm just plugging my computer in here. So if you click on the plant germplasm, that will, I'm going to lead you through a sort of a sample trip through this. So this is the first page you see. Then you have the opportunity to do a simple search. So the last time I made these slides for a talk I gave specifically on this topic of accessing germplasm from the USDA. And I'm sorry, germplasm is a term used to describe any propagated material. So plants, tiny live plants count as germplasm. Seeds are germplasm. Cuttings, bulbs, anything that you can propagate and turn into a new plant is called germplasm. And so from this system, you can get not only seeds, but all of those other things as well, including cuttings of fruit trees and grapevines and all sorts of different things. So I prepared this for the NOFA New York conference, which usually happens in Saratoga Springs. So I typed in Saratoga Springs, and I got 6 entries. Decided to click on this, the third one here, this Helianthus tuberosus. That's a Jerusalem artichoke. And they have some pictures of it. You can click on that shopping cart button there to request it. This was collected in 1985 from Wild Material. If you click on the tabs at the top, you get a little bit more information there. Summary is on the left, then passport. That gives you much more detail exactly where it was collected on Highway 29E, 4.2 kilometers east of Saratoga Springs. The names of the people who collected it. It says plants growing across from Turning Point Country Store in roadside ditch at edge of woods in moist sand. Tubers red. Then if you click taxonomy, it gives you some more information on the species, including all the different common names for it in a number of different languages. And as you may know, the more names for a plant, the more important it is in general. That's a good rule of thumb. And then at the bottom, it has the U.S. National Plant Germplasm System distribution policy. You can see it. They say they distribute plant germplasm to scientists, educators, producers, and other bona fide research and education entities. It further says that fulfilling requests for repatriation of subsamples to a country or community of origin, especially following natural or man-made catastrophes, are considered a high priority. That's, I think, is relatively new language, but I'm glad they put it in there. Although, as I'll mention, I prefer they say rematriation. Although distribution for research, education, and repatriation are of the highest priority, the NPGS also encourages various seed saver organizations and public gardens to conduct germplasm conservation activities that engage many individuals and groups throughout the country. What this basically means is they don't want you to ask for seeds for home use, but if you have any kind of legitimate research, educational, or breeding purpose, or you're going to be rematriating these seeds, you have every right to request these seeds from the government. This is something that belongs to all of us. In fact, if you ask me, it belongs to the entire world. And the seeds are distributed freely. I've received about 2,500 different accessions through the USDA through the years. So they show you information about the seeds. This is all about that sunflower. And then once you click that shopping cart, they give you, they let you, suddenly it goes into a cart. You get seeds like this. Sometimes they look like this with more information. Those are the ones that come from Ames, Iowa. I did another search. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna sort of just go quickly through this one. If you go through if you click the button that says descriptors up at the top, right next to accessions, then you can look at all of the things that have been studied by USDA scientists through the years for all of the different crops you're looking at. So I've selected soybean, and you can do descriptors for all sorts of diseases and pests or flowering date. And what I decided to do with this one was P34, that's protein 34, which is the most common allergen in soy. And of all the USDA's soybean collections, there's over 10,000 of them. 9 of them have low or null P34. These are the 9. They all happen to be wild soybeans, which are just as edible as common soybeans in general, but agronomically not as useful to grow because the seed pods shatter and the seeds fall out, so they're not as easy to harvest. But people do eat them. So I clicked on one of these, and if I wanted to breed a soybean that did not have P34 so that people who are allergic to soybeans could eat it, I would start with this. And this is why these collections are so important, these government collections. I visited the US Clonal Germplasm Repository in Corvallis, Oregon a few years ago, where they have strawberries in tissue culture like this, and this is a hop plant in her hand there. They grow all different varieties of, these are all relatives of raspberries, Rubus genus. They have lots and lots of relatives of blueberries in here. It was an expedition to Southeast Asia that found a blueberry relative that was able to be crossed with our cold, hardy blueberries in North America to enable blueberry production year-round in California. The heat tolerance, low chill hour requirements. This is another Rubus. This is Kim Hummer, who is the director of that germplasm repository, and also a plant explorer herself, who has gone around the world and collected a number of these plants, including those blueberry relatives. So I'll talk briefly about rematriation, and obviously rematriation is a different word than repatriation, and it's used to acknowledge that that seed keepers and seed traditions in many cultures around the world are women, and so it seems more appropriate, and this is now in common use in the small scale seed world, the organic seed movement. This is a tomato from Homs in Syria. This is a kusa squash from Homs in Syria. And this is that same watermelon I showed earlier from Homs. And we were able to get some seeds. Oh, somebody's mic's on there. We were able to get some of these seeds to Syrian refugees in a refugee camp in Lebanon. She's actually not one of the refugees. She worked at the camp, and we were told that they really appreciated, especially that tomato. There were refugees from Homs, and they thought that they would never see that tomato again, but they were able to grow it thanks to one aid worker who learned that we had these seeds and decided to get some from us and bring them back. I mentioned that Nanticoke squash earlier, and from everything I can tell, there have been no Nanticoke people growing that squash for decades. But finally, just about a year ago, I was able to return some to a couple who are Nanticoke who live about a half an hour from me. And Yuri there on the right is on the tribal council, and Corey, who actually reached out to me when she found out about the squash. The two of them are the lead dancers in the Nanticoke troupe. This is some coral sorghum. It's one of my favorite varieties of sorghum, which is a amazing grain from Africa. And that's from a town called Malakal. And Malakal, this is my friend Simon. And Malakal, Simon's people are the Shuluk people, and they developed all of these sorghums. But there are no Shuluk people in Malakal right now because of the civil war. They've all fled across the border to Sudan. But we maintain these crops, and we got them out of the USDA system so that we would have them and be able to return them at some point when we're able to. And the last section here, I know we'll leave a little bit of time for some questions. I've got to talk about a few examples of expanding crop diversity, which is the second half of the title of this. But obviously, you can't expand it if you don't conserve as much as you can. And the section on rematriation, I did want to mention, it's not just important for ethical and moral reasons to return these seeds to the people from whom they came, but for practical reasons of conservation, that the people who develop these seeds, the communities where they came from, are going to be the best stewards of them. And so that's sort of a really simple reason why it's important to do that. I mentioned the potato famine. This is the one potato variety they were growing in Ireland at the beginning of the potato famine, the lumper potato. And this is some of the diversity of potatoes you might find at a market in Peru. But again, they were just eating the lumper in Ireland. If you have diverse potatoes and a blight hits, you'll get some that survive. But if you're only growing one and the blight hits and they're susceptible, you're not going to have any. But we can expand potato diversity by developing more potato varieties, by growing the seeds that come from these little berries and producing new baby potato plants, every one genetically unique. These are a couple that we've grown. Every time you plant a seed of a traditionally clonally propagated crop like asparagus, you're creating new genetic diversity. Same with something like rhubarb. If you cross two varieties together, like this yami squash from the Bolivian Amazon, we crossed it with some Nanticoke squash and developed something that in the first generation looked like this, And in the next generation, we have no idea what it's going to look like. One of our growers for EFN is a guy named Andy Hahn, and he's developing potato onions with a huge amount of diversity. We sell seeds for these. You never know what you're going to get when you plant them. Potato onions are like shallots. You plant one in the fall and it'll split like garlic and give you a whole nest of them in the spring. He also has a diversity of Hablitzia, which is a cold hardy perennial green. And folks like Adaptive Seeds are selling all sorts of diverse collections where they've essentially developed their own landrace, like this kale. Another person who grows seeds for us is Joseph Lofthouse, who's got these tepary bean mixes. Fava beans like these are all grown together. Rocky Mountain, this is the Rocky Mountain wheat Grex. He's also crossing wild tomatoes with tomatoes. The tomatoes are largely self-pollinating. The wild ones are more outcrossing. And so there's a huge amount of diversity coming out of these. Another one of our growers, Casey Piscura, has developed this wide population of winter squash. We sell a combination of kales we call the Dutch Siberian Napus Grex. This is an F4 population of some basils, some wide cross storage onions. These are some purple carrot composite from Claire Luby in Wisconsin. And then one of our favorite projects is the perennial kale Grex, which our friend Chris Homanix has developed from a huge diversity of perennial kales. And this is one of the things that we do through our website, the Experimental Farm Network. Anybody can join and create a project. We're really focused on developing perennials that can help with carbon sequestration, with climate change. I started this following my experience of working on Sandy relief in New Jersey after the hurricane, and seeing maps like this and starting to really think about what climate change was going to do to the world. This is just an image of days above 100 degrees in the 60s and 70s. This is what is projected for the 80s and 90s of this century, where New Jersey will have 60 days above 100 degrees every year. It's going to be a lot harder to grow. So plants can do a great job of sequestering carbon in the ground. The last section here is my favorite crop, which is sorghum. This is an annual sorghum. Sorghum pops like popcorn. You can press the stalks and squeeze out juice and get nice green juice that boils down to a delicious molasses. There's a huge diversity of sorghums out there, and we're utilizing some of this diversity to try and work on developing perennial sorghum that can be grown as a crop to replace some of the annual monoculture crops that we grow across the country. By crossing this wild sorghum relative called Johnson grass with annual sorghum, folks have developed this perennial that's hardy in the Pacific Northwest. We're trying to develop one that's hardy here in the Mid-Atlantic, and we're getting there. We had this one plant survived one winter, and so far the offspring from that plant have survived. We had 4 of them survive one more winter, so we're getting there. That's the last slide. I know I have left very little time for questions, but
we've got a few lined up, so we'll try to blast through them.
Okay.
So this one is from Randy. Is there a link to more detail about those 26 wild crop species in North America?
Not that I know of. That article, yeah, I don't see it. I'll try and find something and put it in the chat after this.
That would be awesome. This next question is, are there particular seed sources Nate or others recommend for vegetable and pollinator gardens?
There's a huge range. I think it's most important to, look for seed companies in your bioregion. In our area, there's not very many. We sell seeds that are grown in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and True Love Seeds is another wonderful company. Hudson Valley Seeds in New York State. Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is down in Virginia. These are sort of the biggest regional organic seed companies in our area. And Fruition Seeds in Central New York. There's a few really good ones, and then Native Seeds. There's a great project that actually NOFA Connecticut is doing called the Ecotype Project that has lots of really good information on how best practices for collecting seeds from the wild for native pollinator gardens.
Yeah, it's important to remember that, you know, just like with everything else that we do, you know, we got to shop local for our seeds whenever it's possible.
Yeah.
So next question from Paula. Could you please repeat the name of the strawberry species found on Route 1 in Maine?
Sure. That was the Virginia strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, also just known as the wild strawberry in most of the East Coast.
Okay.
All right. Stephen says, it's fantastic talk and thank you for your work. Can you please talk about the migrating dangers of mitigating my eyes, mitigating dangers of introducing problematic invasive dominating varieties into native ecosystems as we share seeds and experiment with varieties from around the world?
Sure, that's certainly an issue to be aware of. And you know, when we get seeds from the USDA collection, we're very careful not to get things that are classified as noxious weeds or prohibited in our area. But you know, I think it's important to remember that the landscapes that we exist in now have been greatly altered by colonization over the last 400 years, and it's very, very hard to find any place in this continent that's untouched by invasive species. And in many places, the vast majority of species that you find growing are invasive species. Now, that's not to say we don't have an obligation to prevent things like that from happening. But I think, you know, so many of the species that we grow, if we're observant and careful, it's very easy to grow things and not have them get into the natural ecosystem. But you know, to be honest, I'm much more concerned with the things that corporations are doing on a massive scale, introducing genetically modified organisms, many of which cross with plants that already exist in the wild. And you know, I'm much more concerned about biotech getting into the natural ecosystems than I am about you know, a cucumber from Bhutan going wild in around my field. But these are legitimate concerns, and I appreciate the question.
Well, Nate, we're going to wrap things up. So we want to say thank you for your talk and for what you're doing. We appreciate knowing there's a future for seeds because that's what we do. So I guess we're going to move on to our next speaker, Rowan White of Sierra Seeds.